Hi, I'm Paul Santinello, and welcome to The Upside. On today's show, we're going to be talking with Garry Brown. Garry is a former and current writer for the Republican, which was the Daily News and the Morning Union at some point in time. And Garry's written a book called Garry Brown's Greatest Hits, and we're going to talk to Garry about this, his career, and so forth. Garry, first, thank you for coming.
Well, glad to be here.
So one of the first thing I'm going to ask you is, and not to, but I think you write about it in the book, so I'm not going to reveal any secrets. When did you start at the? It was the Daily News and Morning Union at the time, right?
It was the Morning Union,
yeah.
1950, if you want to believe that. I was 18 years old, and somehow I got a job there, and I just loved it so much. I made a life out of it.
Yeah, and when you were, now I read in the book, you weren't even in college when you were offered the position.
Right. No, I finished my first year at AIC.
Okay.
And I got this job.
Yep.
So I quit school thinking, I got a job. I don't have to go to school anymore. And luckily, though, I was working with Joe Napoleon. I don't know if you remember him.
Oh, no, that's what I was just going to ask you about that.
He turned out to be a great political consultant.
Yeah.
And he was working in sports at that time and going to AIC. And he said, if I can go to school, you can go. You should go finish.
Yeah.
So I went back a year later, and luckily, because I went back, I sat next to my future wife in 3 classes, and we were married eventually. And Joe Napoleon actually changed my life, really.
Yeah, literally, in more ways than one, right? So, and that was amazing. That I read in here that first of all, when I read the name Joe Napoleon, I thought maybe that's just a different guy, and then you'd explained that it was the Joe Napoleon who's consulted kings and queens and political people all over the world, and that it was even more revealing that he worked in the sports department for a guy who's a political consultant.
Well, at that time, he was covering high school sports, believe it or not.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
And I followed him. I became the high school writer after he transferred to the city department, became a regular reporter, and that's eventually how he went on to his own career. Okay,
and you touched on this, that if it wasn't for that, you wouldn't have went to school again, and you happened to sit next to this young girl who you thought was pretty stuck on you because of your clothing style, right?
No, I thought that if she can be stuck on me in spite of my clothes,
in spite of it,
she must be all right,
Yeah, and I would encourage you to get this book, and we'll talk about that later where you can get it, but because you have to read what Garry's clothing style was at the time, and it wouldn't even fit in today's world either, so that's okay. When you first started, there's a lot of stories in here about covering local sports. Everything from pee-wee baseball on up to the pros and stuff.
Yeah.
And, obviously, today guys are blogging more than they're writing about columns, than there are columns and such. But to me, it's the golden era, more or less, of newspapers when people look forward. I used to deliver the Daily News, and then later on in life, I delivered when I was in high school, the Morning Union, so I could go to school and play sports afterwards and stuff. But people look forward to that newspaper, and if you were, God forbid, half an hour late with your paper and they couldn't read it after dinner, my parents got a phone call, asking where I was, and typically we'd be playing sports somewhere, but it's really changed. I mean, obviously there's no more, morning and evening paper, there's one paper, but a lot of that local ambiance is gone, right? I mean, of reporting on you used to put in box scores of some of the games. I remember playing Little League games where we were in the playoffs and our box scores were in it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the newspaper business has just changed so much that you have to accept the way it is now. And I'm like a dinosaur because I remember how it used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other stories in here that you wrote about, I read that and I had to read it again, was about Yaz and the children of who only knew the Red Sox with Yaz.
Yeah.
And I was one of them.
Uh-huh.
Okay, because I used to, the legend was that I was a right-handed batter until I saw the '67 Sox, and I'm a lefty in baseball. Okay, batting anyway. But talk about that, because it was an interesting piece, and like I said, I had to reread it again because I said that was where I was when you wrote that article.
Yeah. Well, that was funny how that worked out. Tommy Shea was covering the Red Sox at that time, and as his final weekend was coming up, and he said, he said, you know him a lot better than I do. He says, would you mind doing that weekend? I said, sure.
Yeah.
So I went down, and when I wrote that, I was thinking about my own kids, because they grew up. They were, 6, 7 years old, and they were going to grow up, and the only guy that they ever knew was Yaz.
Yeah.
And people a little older than that, that's the only one they would know. And when you think about that, these people, they sort of, Yaz is always going to be with the Red Sox,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So that's what set me off to write that. And it turned out it made the best sports stories of 1983. I was shocked to hear that one, but
Yeah.
it really, it's one of my favorite pieces, really.
Yeah, and like I said, I reread it because I said, yeah, I can relate to that very much, because that's all I knew on the Red Sox at the time, up until the day he retired, that Yaz was there. And, over time I've met a couple folks that played with him, but, they were here and there and come and gone, and, had their cup of coffee in Boston type of thing. One of the things in here, too, that kind of intrigued me about the sports that happened in Wilbraham all the time, the baseball games and in the front yard and, at Christmas time.
Yeah.
What does the Christmas baseball, where did you play that? I was trying to figure, was that in the basement or outside?
Well, that was...
Well, let me say, why don't you explain to people what I mean by that?
There's a column in there about the leagues that we used to have, and the so-called leagues we had in Wilbraham. They're actually just our own family things,
Yeah.
right? But, no, there was no baseball inside except dart baseball.
Dart baseball,
That's
yeah.
what you're thinking
Yeah.
of. Yeah. But, we'd play wiffle ball in the front yard, and bowling down the driveway, then basketball and hockey in the cellar.
Yeah.
And so...
But in here you talk about it being a Christmas tradition.
Well, yeah, at Christmas, we have one grandson, and right after dinner he'd say, "Grandpa," and he'd go like that. He wanted to play hockey. So I'd take him down, and he'd fire slap shots at me. Lucky they were tennis balls, or he would have killed me. But it just went on like that. Then we'd go up and have cheesecake, and then back down and playing basketball. Maybe at that time, I had a little hoop up, and everybody played that one. So I reached a point where I said, when they're getting older, I said, geez, no more of that. So I decided to write a column about it.
No more slap shots anyway.
Yeah.
So in your career, which is, you say you started in 1950, and you're still contributing, right? So, I mean, you're not there every day, but you're still contribute to the Republican and such. Of all the things that you covered, because I want to talk about your rides down to Boston and so forth, but what was the most favorite or memorable event that you've covered in your career?
Well, I wouldn't say one event. I would say the most favorite thing I did was covering high school sports. And it's because I met so many great, first of all, coaches. Yeah. Billy Wise, Bill Mauger. You could go on and on with Ted Plum at Trade. Yeah. What a great guy he was. And a lot of great people along the way, and the other thing was I covered Pee Wee baseball when I started. So when I went to cover high schools, all the kids that were playing back then were now playing high school, and I knew all of them. Yeah. And I had a good handle on everything. So, but I did that for 16 years, which is the longest anybody has ever done it at the Springfield paper, and it was my favorite time, really. Okay. I've covered World Series, everything, NBA, NHL, Super Bowl, but I like the high schools the best.
And you went to all these different games.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you did a lot of nighttime work. Oh yeah. Obviously, right? Yeah. And that was one of the things that you were working nights and going to school during the day when you were at AIC. Yeah. And so most of your work, if covering high school, obviously took you nighttime travels. But then you started covering the Red Sox.
Yeah. Well, that was later on. Yeah.
Later on, and one of the stories in here that I found pretty funny is that your wife would drive you from the game, and you would be typing on your typewriter in the car. Is that that's accurate?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
You wrote your stories in the car, so now she hit the brakes. Did someone get a strikeout or something? Versus.
Well, she, early in our marriage, she bought me a little Olivet thing called an Olivetti actual typewriter.
Yeah.
You don't see those anymore. And it very light. You could carry it around. It was
Yep.
perfect for what I had to do. And we'd go to a game on Sunday, and she'd drive home, and by the time we got home, my story would be finished.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
And that was at the time where did you have to hand in the actual paper, or were you calling it in?
well, in that
Or
case,
both.
I would drive back
Yeah.
and I could hand it in.
You could
because
hand it in.
But, we did, some stories had to be dictated over the telephone.
How long would that take you when after a ball game, how long would it take to dictate a story? First you had to write it,
Yeah.
and then you had to dictate it, right?
Yeah. Well, it would be an hour tops. You could write it in half an hour and dictate it.
And dictate it back.
Yeah.
And I remember I had a boxing match that I ran one time, and I remember we talked about Carlo Emilio in there, and he had to go in a thing and plug his little machine in or whatever and type
Yeah.
it and send it in.
Yeah.
And that was obviously a little bit, he could type it and send it in, but he was on the phone still making sure that it came through okay and all that stuff. So you still had to follow up even though you mail
Yeah.
today, and now you email it in.
Well, there was another part of that. Sometimes we'd use Western Union, and with that, you never knew. Was it there or wasn't it there? You couldn't tell. You'd have to call up and say, "Did you get my story?" And hope they
So
did.
you would go to a Western Union,
Well, no.
or was there one at the park?
Well, if you had a major event, there would be Western Union
Okay.
operators there. But there was one time I covered Pittsfield Legion team, 1957, way back there. And they played in a little place called Elton, Maryland. I don't know why they had it. This was a national tournament
Okay.
in this little town. I mean, it had a skin diamond. It was a terrible place. But, and, I'm covering the tournament, and we have to get the story in, and there's no Western Union anywhere. So we had to, luckily I had a friend of mine, Paul Donahue, who said, "I'll go with you. I love Legion baseball." So he drove, and luckily because he was there, he drove me to Wilmington, Delaware from Elton to Maryland after every game. And by the time we'd get there, my story would be done too.
Yeah.
And we'd hand it into the Western Union.
And then they would send it up to to another
Yeah.
Western Union place to bring it to the
Yeah.
newspaper.
And the newspaper had believe it or not, they had a full-time Western Union guy at the newspaper, and he would
Okay.
he would listen to the Morse code and
Yeah.
type the story.
Oh, really?
It's amazing. And he was really good. The guy was great.
So he's getting the message. He's getting your story in Morse code.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
retyping it. Wow, that's amazing. And that's the other thing in the stories that you have in this book. We talk about like some of the tournaments that were around, and the different levels of play. I mean, everything is much more organized now, I think. But there was that level of like the industrial league baseball.
Yeah.
And Tri-County. When I remember as a kid, Tri-County was big. You actually knew the names of the guys on the Tri-County teams.
Sure.
Because they were being covered so well by the paper. It wasn't major leagues, but when you talked about something, it was like, oh my God, that guy's on Tri-County. And I remember going to the games and saying, oh, those are the guys that you see in the paper, and that's kind of gone though.
Yeah,
In a way,
well,
right?
it's what we were talking about before. The business has just changed so much, it's not covered the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I know Tri-County's still around in a form,
Yeah,
but it's not
yeah.
really quite the same as. It doesn't get the same coverage, like you said, of it. But those were big events at the time. I mean, you could have a Tri-County Green game. I remember at the grandstand at Forest Park, drawing some people to it. Maybe not minor league level, but
Yeah.
good amount of people going to a game because A, it was entertainment, and B, it was being written about. So
Yeah.
you got to follow. I mean, you could pick a favorite team.
Yeah. But, I mentioned how high school was my favorite. An adjunct to that was American Legion baseball because all the high school kids played that all
Yeah.
summer. So I loved covering that as well. And you talk about crowds. I mean, Chicopee in 1961, when they won the state baseball championship, there were 6,000 people at Zot Park.
Wow.
For the final game.
For a final game for that,
Yeah.
yeah. You won't find too much of that
No.
not for baseball
No.
nowadays. Yeah, I remember we played in a daily news tournament. We were in the semifinals in 10-12 baseball at what's now was Quinfield, and we probably had about 200-300 people there
Yeah.
for a game, which was amazing for that level. And I wasn't one of the starters on that team at that point, but. There's a lot of story. One of the things I found interesting in here too is that your coverage. Now, when some of these stories that you wrote about with the little league teams, because there's a story about a Pee Wee team that Romeo Sears started the league, and on that team was our current sheriff, Mike Ash. Are those in here, or did you have to go look those up?
No, it's all here.
All there. So you're that kind of person that you can tell me, if I gave you a date, you can tell me what ballpark you were probably at, as opposed to what happened in the world or something. Well, so those stories are still, because of what your coverage of way back when, you have those in your head, and because it reads like that.
Yeah,
it reads like we're talking now, that it's a conversation as opposed to something that was taken from the archives and just replanted.
Yes, and the reason this book came about was a friend of mine, Richard Anderson, who wrote a book about the post-21 American Legion team in 1934 that went to Gastonia, and he said, you have a lot of good stuff, you should put it together. And I said, well, I have no idea how to do that. And he said, well, the stuff you write doesn't have to be in a certain format, because everything is different. He said, you can go from one to another, it doesn't matter. So I threw together 107 pieces, and there were still some that I wish I could have put in that I left out because I thought it was too much. And then I turned it over to this great guy in Amherst who's a publisher, and he made a book out of it. You say I wrote a book. No, I didn't write a book. I just put everything together that I had already written.
Well, you laid the foundation over 50 years, 60 years of journalism, so you did write a book. It just, and you could have probably wrote a greatest hits #2 and 3 and so forth if you wanted to. I want you to talk about the American Legion post-21 team that you just mentioned, because I think that's it obviously a forgotten story for a long time. But I want you to tell folks about that story, and it is meaningful in a lot of different ways.
Yes. There are actually 2 stories in the book about that. Well, what happened in 1934 was they went down to, they were Northeast champs, and they went to the Eastern tournament in Gastonia, North Carolina, and the winner there would play in the National World Series. And they got there and found out that their one black player, Bunny Talaferro, not only couldn't play, he couldn't stay in the hotel, he couldn't attend the banquet that they were supposed to go to, and he would have to be placed somewhere out of town while the tournament was going on. He wouldn't be allowed. And they did go to one practice, and Bunny went with them, and he hit a few balls over the left field wall, and that only incensed the crowd even more. They didn't want him around. And I remember Franny Luce, who was the first baseman on that team, told me that they were walking back to the hotel, and he said somebody came up behind him and said, "You're going to get the same thing that he's going to get." And there were a couple of, some really...
and it wasn't congratulations either.
Really scary threats. And so...
And these are kids.
Yeah,
they're high school kids.
They're 15 and 16 years old. And one of the other kids told me, when I interviewed Lou Grondalski, who was the right fielder on that team, he said, we walked up to the hotel, and the sign on the hotel said, I hope I can say this, no dogs or niggers allowed.
Oh, jeez.
And he said, I saw that sign, and I thought we shouldn't even be here, And so after they found out that there was no way that Bunny was going to play, the coach said that he called everybody together, and he said, what are we going to do? We can probably win this tournament without Bunny, or we can not play because we want to stick with Bunny. What do you want to do? And it was unanimous. They said, let's go home.
Yep.
That was the decision.
But when they got here,
there was a crowd of welcoming them like they had won the tournament, But as Judge Keys, who was he was a backup infielder on that team, Danny Keys, he said that people think what a great thing it was, but he said it was really the only thing to do, not just the right thing. It was the only thing to do. But when you think about, 15 and 16-year-old kids taking a stand like that at a time like that, in the middle of the 1930s, in the segregated South, it's an amazing story, really.
But in the welcome reception when I got back to Springfield, like you said, it was almost like it was a hero's welcome in a way.
Yeah.
And years later, though, there's actually a plaque dedicated to that team in Forest Park.
Well, that's the second part of the story. For some reason, that story sort of almost got forgotten in Springfield.
Yeah.
And there was a great guy, Dr. Martin Murray, who was a tremendous athlete at Cathedral and Holy Cross himself. And he was older than these kids, and he knew all about that team, and he watched them play and all that. And he called Billy Sullivan, the former mayor of Springfield, and he said, we got to do something to honor this team, or Springfield is going to forget about them. We can't let that happen. Mm-hmm. So he organized a little fund drive, and they put together a nice monument and dedicated it. It didn't happen until 2003. Yeah. And, 10 more years and nobody would have remembered anything, right? Yeah. So, but they, the two of them are the basic reason why that story came back. And once it came back, I picked it up and we gave it a lot of coverage. And
yeah. And they try to petition to the Legions, the organization, to get this team over to the national championship because they thought they deserved a shot the way they were treated, and that went nowhere either.
No, and then actually the National Legion doesn't even want to know about this story. Yeah. I think if you looked at the records in Indianapolis, the headquarters, it doesn't even say that Springfield played in Gastonia.
Oh, wow. And these are, like I said, these were kids, but not only were they kids, they're kids from different teams. This wasn't, sometimes a Legion team can be made up primarily of from one particular school, for example, but they had kids from all over, including West Side, so it wasn't just a Springfield team either. Right. But they all came together for this, to make that decision. And like you said, the coach said that they probably could have won it without him, but Bunny Talaferro was their best player.
He really was, yeah. But as Judge Key said, if the bat boy had been black and they told him he couldn't be there, we would have come home too. Yeah, pretty tough stance for young kids to make a decision like that, And, I really think that would make a great movie if somebody knew how to write a script for it, which I don't. But
Well, first the book, then we'll work on the movie script after. Yeah. And then one of the favorite columns, and I'm sure the majority of people who watch this will agree, is one of my favorite columns that you've ever done is Hitting to All Fields. And I don't know, because maybe it was easy to read and you didn't have to have a long attention span like me.
Yeah, right.
But what started that? And I mean, some of these things, it's, I read the first one was in 1973.
Imagine that.
But it was one of the things that I look forward to reading when it came out, reading the sports section, looking for it, and I would, that was one of my favorite things to read, because just my biggest kick I got was your all-time favorite sports names and how you came about that. But what brought about Hitting to All Fields?
Well, I was in the 70s. I was sports editor at the Morning Union. But I wanted to write a couple of columns a week just to keep my hand in as a writer. Yeah. And so I'm there one night. I need a column, but I have nothing to write about, Yeah. So I hit upon this idea of there's a guy in New York named Jimmy Cannon who used to write a column called Nobody Asked Me But, and he would do it was mostly not about sports, but a lot of different opinions. So I sort of based it on that kind of format, but then I made it all sports, and I just turned one out that night, and it came out pretty well. Yeah. And I even got a couple letters about it. So I decided, why don't I do this every week? Yep. And who can imagine? I never thought about it that I would be still doing it now. Yeah. My God.
Well, my favorite thing is I told you your first one is the very first mention in your first one is a guy, a friend of mine we've had on the show, Fran Tarkenton, and you were wondering if he was going to march through Georgia when he played the Falcons. They got creamed.
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to send that to him just so he sees that from this book. I'm going to send it to him. But you also have something called Ye Old Handicapper.
Oh yeah.
And your track record is phenomenal.
Phenomenally bad.
Phenomenally bad, but it's still phenomenal.
Yeah.
And you've gotten some of your more positive feedback, or you've gotten, let's just say positive, more feedback probably on your handicapping, I would imagine, or maybe it's the Labrador stories.
The dog is number one.
The dog's number one, yeah.
I got more people asking me about the dog than, I could write about the Red Sox or anything.
Yeah.
All they want to know is, how's the dog doing? I see people at the supermarket, and that's what they talk about.
Yeah.
And but you talked about Ye Old Handicapper. I got an email one time from a guy who's a lawyer in Springfield, by the way. He played baseball at Williams College. A very smart guy, good athlete, and he follows horses. And one week I picked Zenyatta. Remember, Zenyatta was 19-0.
Yeah.
And going into her last, she was going to run one more race in the Breeders' Cup, and that would be it. And she lost by like that much. And of course I picked her to win. But everybody picked her to win, I think. And so I get this email from, his name is Ron Kidd, by the way. I might as well get his name out there.
Yeah.
But he's from West Springfield, and he played at Williams. And he had an email, the subject said, "Only You." And I saw that, and I said, "Oh, this must be about the Platters, that song, I Love Only You."
Yeah.
And the email said, "Only you can take an undefeated horse and turn her into an also-ran." So that's the kind of mail I get from the handicapper. And I had one little old lady ask me one time, "Is the Ye Old Handicapper, is that about golf?" I said, "Maybe it should be."
Should be. So in here you talk about some interviews, and there's a couple that you touched on. One of them, Bobby Dorr.
Oh yeah.
Okay, because you were going to replace him, right, at second base. That's the story. But how was that? What was the feeling of first, you see Bobby Dorr as a kid playing, and then you get to meet him. What was it like for you?
That's an awesome feeling. You can't really explain it, because when you're a little kid and you love a ball player, you just really look up to him. You know what that's like.
Yeah.
And then when you actually get to meet him, it's almost like you're afraid to approach him. But I finally got up the nerve.
Yeah.
And he was really.
First of all, let me go backward. How old were you at the time to get up the nerve? How old were you? About?
Let's see. He was coaching the Red Sox in 1967. He was first base coach, and that's how I got to meet him.
Okay.
I had never met him, and.
But it still generated butterflies and everything, right there.
So
that's pretty cool.
Anyway, the other part of that story is we didn't cover the Red Sox regularly at that time. We used the Associated Press, but in 1967, all of a sudden, they're starting to look like they might win the pennant. And so we started covering. So I went down. They sent me down in August of that year, and there's Bobby Dorr. So it took me maybe 5 or 6 games before I got up the nerve to approach him. But when I finally did, he gave me a great interview. Really one of the greatest guys I've ever met.
And you got a picture to prove it. So that's a good thing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other things in here that I thought was kind of not funny, but I smiled, was the Pedro Martinez story.
Oh yeah.
Why don't you tell folks about that one?
Well, we have 3 grandchildren in Amherst. The oldest one, she was 12 at the time, and she came up to her father one time. She said, "Can I play baseball?" And he said, "Well, I don't see why not." So she signed up for the Amherst Little League, and run by Stan Zomack, who was one of the great figures in Western Mass sports. And Stan was the first one to allow girls to play Little League in his Amherst program. So she played, actually she played 2 years. She played when she was 11 and again when she was 12. And the boys accepted her pretty well. She got along all right. In the last game she played, she made a nice running catch of a foul ball to end the game. And that was the end of her baseball career. But anyway, while she was doing that, Pedro was having a great year with the Red Sox, and she loved Pedro. This must have been 1998, maybe.
Okay.
99. And so she said to me one time, "Grandpa, can you get me Pedro's autograph?" I said, "No." I said, "Sports writers aren't supposed to do that. We don't ask players for autograph. That's a no-no." And she said, "Well, how about if I sign a picture of myself and give it to him? Would he give me one back?" I said, "Boy, that sounds like a pretty good idea."
Oh, pretty good for a kid, huh? Yeah, not bad.
So she had we had this picture of her kneeling in the on-deck circle and on the bat. She looked like a real ball player. And she wrote to Pedro Martinez, my favorite baseball player. And I took it to Fenway the next time we were covering at home, and I walked up to Pedro and I said, "My granddaughter wants you to have this, Pedro." He looked at it. He put it up on the top of his locker, and he kept it there for the rest of the year.
Oh, wow.
And I said, "You know, do you think you might be able to sign a picture for her?" And he said, see me tomorrow," he said. So I came in the next day, and he had this envelope with a signed picture all ready for me. And I gave it to Sonia, and she's put it up in her room, and he's got her in his locker.
Yeah.
It was a nice story.
Yeah, nice. What did he call you? You got to tell.
Oh, I was, let's see, that was 1998. You know, I was in my 60s then, late 60s. And he said, he used to call me my old man.
My old man.
He'd say, I'd come up to me and said, "How's my old man?"
That's okay.
But he was, you know, nice. He was being friendly about it, and he always was easy to approach. And but you know, that was really nice.
For a guy who could be somewhat demonized on the ball field for some of his tactics of throwing inside, and, he really seems to have that heart of gold.
Yeah, he's a totally different person when he's not pitching.
Yeah, right. Pitching, he probably would have beamed you if you asked him for an autograph. But that's a great story, and I love the fact that he took your granddaughter's picture and put it in his locker. That just tells you something about the kind of guy he is, too.
Right. Yeah.
So we have some time, Doug. How much more time? 0. Okay, so first we're going to talk about where do you find this book? How can people get this book, Garry Brown's Greatest Hits?
The easiest way is levelerspress.com.
Levelerspress.com.
And they'll be able to find it there.
And if you can't find it, you can reach us here at LCTV, and we can put you into contact with levelerspress.com.
There's also a website called hitting12fields.com.
Okay.
That would have it.
Okay, very good. So hittingtallfields.com or levelerspress.com. Garry, thank you for coming in for the interview. I appreciate it. It's a great book. You should read it. There's a lot of stories in here that really hit home.
Great. Thank you.
Have a great day. Folks, thanks for watching The Upside. You have a great day. We'll see you on the next show.
Thank you.